Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're embarking on this absolutely fascinating journey right into the architecture of your own head. We're exploring a field that bridges two massive areas of science. We're looking at exactly how the mind interacts with language. Have you ever stopped to actually think about how you understand the words I'm saying to you right now? Or how a random thought just magically transforms into a fully formed sentence? Well, that is exactly the mystery we're unpacking today. To get to the bottom of this, we really need to talk about psycholinguistics, which is, quite simply, the psychology of language. It's the scientific study of how language interacts with the human mind. We're focusing deeply on two main things here: how we comprehend language when we're receiving it, and how we actually produce it when we want to express a thought. It's kind of like the invisible bridge between raw brain power and the spoken word. Here's our cognitive roadmap for today. We'll be journeying chronologically. First up, hardwired for language. Then, number 2, shaping our reality. And finally, number 3, the architecture of memory. Let's get going. Section 1, hardwired for language, Chomsky's universal grammar. Let's solve the scientific mystery of how children acquire language so incredibly fast. So Noam Chomsky proposed this totally revolutionary answer to the mystery. He called it the language acquisition device, or the LAD for short. This is a hypothetical tool that's basically hardwired into the brain, helping kids rapidly learn and understand language. Now look, this isn't some physical organ you can just spot on an X-ray. Actually, the LAD represents what are likely hundreds, maybe even thousands, of evolved underlying brain processes. And these processes, they're exactly what make humanity fundamentally exceptional at grasping the complex rules of language without ever needing a textbook. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how human babies know syntax, kind of like baby birds know migration patterns. A baby bird just seems to, inherently know these incredibly complex migration routes without being handed a map or explicitly taught. According to Chomsky, human babies are exactly the same when it comes to syntax. Kids are born with an understanding of the fundamental rules of language already pre-installed in their heads. The heavy lifting is already done by our biology. So all kids really need to do is just acquire the local vocabulary to fill in the blanks. And this brilliantly illustrates the underlying complexity of universal grammar. It's like looking at complex equations. It looks totally overwhelming to a lot of us. But to a mathematician, there are universal rules governing the whole shebang. Language is exactly the same way. Chomsky posed that language is fundamentally similar across all of humanity. Beneath the surface of, say, English, Mandarin, Arabic, or Spanish, we all actually share the exact same grammatical skeleton. For example, every single language has something acting like a noun and a verb. Every language can frame things positively or negatively. We're literally all running on the same fundamental human operating system. But what's the actual evidence for this? Well, just look at how toddlers behave. Chomsky noticed that kids don't make the random errors you'd expect if they were truly a blank slate. First off, they instinctually grasp sentence structures, like subject-verb-object, long before they can even speak in full, fluent sentences. Second, young kids will routinely notice if adults around them make grammatical errors, and they're usually pointed out loudly, right? And third, they apply standard grammatical rules to words that are actually exceptions in their language. They're acting on an innate biological instinct, which pretty much proves they have this internal rulebook guiding them. Section 2. Shaping our reality, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Let's move to and see how this builds from our innate language acquisition to how the specific languages we learn actually shape our perception of the world. Consider the sheer power of words for a second. Freedom fighters versus terrorists, or surgical strikes versus bombing raids. These are stark dichotomies describing the exact same worldly events. Many researchers believe that language actively shapes our thoughts. That's exactly why the APA, politicians, the media, they all place such a huge emphasis on terminology. The neutral reality of an event can be entirely reshaped in the public's mind simply by choosing a different label. The words we use quite literally provide the framework for how we judge the action. Which leads us to a pretty fascinating question for you to consider. Do the Garo people of Burma think about rice differently than we do? The Garo are a rice-growing culture, right? So their language has tons of distinct words for different kinds of rice. In a similar way, nomadic Arabs have over 20 different words for camels. Because they have a more specific, complex language for these things, do they physically conceptualize and perceive rice, or camels, differently than someone who just uses one generic catch-all word? Benjamin Lee Whorf believed the answer to that was absolutely yes. Just listen to this incredibly powerful quote. We dissect nature along lines laid down by our native languages. The world is presented in a kaleidoscopic flux of impressions, which has to be organized by our minds. So the crucial point is that reality itself is just this chaotic, swirling flux of raw data. It's our language that steps in to organize, categorize, and make sense of that chaos. We don't just objectively see the world. We see the world that our specific language allows us to see. Now, within the scientific community, this hypothesis actually breaks down into two distinct versions. First, there's linguistic determinism. That's the strong version. It states that language completely determines your thought. Basically, if you don't have a word for it, you absolutely cannot think it. Now, that strict view is generally less accepted today. But then we have linguistic relativity. This is the weak version, which argues that language merely influences or shapes our thinking, kind of predisposing us to certain interpretations. This nuanced view is highly accepted, and it really shows that speakers of different languages do, for sure, perceive the world differently. Section 3. The Architecture of Memory. Bartlett's Schema Theory. Now we transition to our final stop to see how we actually store and recall these worldly, language-shaped experiences. To really understand memory, we have to talk about schemata. Think of a schema as a glowing light bulb of insight going off in your head. Schema are basically mental structures that we acquire through our routine everyday experiences. Think of them as mental blueprints. Every single time you experience something, you're building a schema that sets up your expectations for what usually happens. They light up, helping you interpret what's going on right now based on what you already know, and they guide exactly how you're going to remember it later. Frederick Bartlett argued that memory is an incredibly active process. You don't just experience an event and neatly file it away. Nope. First, you experience the event. Second, you filter it through your existing cultural expectations, your schema. And third, you imaginatively reconstruct the memory. We really need to drop the idea that the brain is just some passive tape recorder faithfully playing back the past. It's definitely not. Every time you remember something, you're actively rebuilding it using the blueprints you already have. Bartlett actually proved this through a really famous study on storytelling. He found that adults are incredibly good at summarizing and remembering stories that come from their own culture. And why? Well, because the story naturally matches their existing schema. But when he had people read a highly unfamiliar narrative from a distinctly different culture, something amazing happened. As time passed, people didn't just forget the details. They actually imaginatively distorted the story to make it fit into their existing knowledge. They reconstructed the past so it made sense to their own specific linguistic and cultural worldview. Mind-blowing, right? Which leaves us with this final, thrilling puzzle to ponder. We started with Chomsky, discovering that our innate biological wiring dictates how we process information. Then we moved to Sapir-Whorf, learning that our specific language filters and shapes our daily perception of that whole kaleidoscopic flux around us. And finally, Bartlett showed us that even our memories are actively reconstructed and sometimes distorted by our cultural expectations. So, if our innate wiring limits us, our language influences our perception, and our memory constantly reconstructs the past, how much of what we experience every single day is actually real? It's a question that challenges literally everything we think we know about ourselves, and I really hope it leaves you hungry to keep exploring the incredible journey of your own mind.